Welcome back to hour number 2 of the Gary Sutton Show on WSBA. I am Gary Sutton, and glad to be with you on a Wednesday morning as we progress through the week. 26 degrees out there. Yeah, Mark had a pause after that, too. I tell you what, it was so cold last night. I mean, it was amazing for this time of year. So, can't even get the golf clubs out. That's the terrible part of all this. Anyway. Another place that gets cold is Montana, and that's where our next guest is from. Although he started out as a New York guy, he's decided to kind of jump out of the rat race and head off to the place where you're off the grid, period. Go out and do it on your own. The rugged individualist, if you will. He's Rich Sheeban. He's been with us before on our show. He's a man who went off the grid, and he also wrote a book called One New York Man's Journey to Get Off to Off-Grid Living in Montana. And he's back with us here on the Gary Sutton Show. Rich, great to have you back on the show. Good morning to you.
Hey, thank you, Gary. I really appreciate you having me on.
Always a pleasure, my friend, and hope all's going well. It gets a little cold out in your neck of the woods, too, doesn't it?
It does. I've been in Montana for 28 years, and I would say that this November could be one of the coldest Novembers I've seen in my 28 years in Montana.
Wow. Before the 28 years, just to refresh people, you were a New York guy. I mean, you were right there in the middle of corporate America, and you were hammering away like a lot of other people are, and at some point in time, you just said, enough. Tell us a little bit about that story.
Yeah, well, I was born and raised in the metropolitan area of New York City. I was born in Jamaica, Queens. I lived in the metropolitan area for about 26 years, and I got a couple degrees out there. One was in forestry, and I went to an interview for the National Forest Service, and they just told me straight out back in the early 80s that they would not hire me as a white male. I switched gears. I got into the pharmaceutical industry, worked there for 4 years, handed my company car keys over to my manager and told him that I was going to Montana to pursue my dream. And I got back into the pharmaceutical industry after getting my third college degree at the University of Montana, and did about 19 more years here. And then I had some major health issues with spinal stenosis and nerve damage, and I've lost about 90% of the strength of my arms and hands. So if anybody thinks that this life may be too rugged for them or too physical, anybody could do anything with moderation and modifications, folks. So I decided that I've always wanted to live off the land. I wanted to hunt for my meat, catch my own fish, can. We own no freezer. We basically can everything that we have as far as preserving food. We don't have any traditional running water or flushing toilets. We do a gravity feed to the sink. We have an Amish wood-cooked stove that heats our water and gives us heat in the cabin, and everything is simplified. And living off-grid is so simple, folks, because unlike 90% of Americans, we don't have smart meters. We don't have the ability, or the powers that be don't have the ability to shut off our appliances or to know what appliances we use or when we're home or not. You know, that data gets mined. Who knows who's getting that? So we have our own power plant, if you will, and create our own solar power. And, you know, we live a little more rugged than most of you would think. But it's a fun life, and I've been doing talks and radio shows for over a year now and giving a lot of people a lot of ideas and solutions on how to simplify their life, Gary.
You know, one of the things that we talk about all the time here, Rich, is the idea that our founding fathers, I think, and people say, well, we had slavery. Well, okay, despite slavery, and we did make some changes on that later on, thank heavens. But the idea that we were to be an independent country where we had people based on what I mentioned about you a moment ago, rugged individualism, the blue-collar ethic later on, that we should have as much as possible financial, economic, social freedom in this country, and even political freedom in this country. When you look at where we are today, and you've had a chance to kind of, I think, dwell on this because you've lived a different lifestyle here, how do we get back the idea that Americans get to a more self-sufficient thing and more independent style of living? Because it seems to me that dependency is being preached by our leaders. It is being offered by the programs. We see, for example, food stamps being doubled over the last 6 years. When we see the welfare programs out there that people, and some people have learned to turn into a business, that is not the America that I would think a guy like you or people who are thinking about America in an independent way want to see.
Well, what's happening, Gary, is all these words that you mentioned, including tolerance, fairness, equality, these are all politically correct buzzwords by people who do not practice what they preach. The people in charge basically are the most intolerant people out there. And there's a law of diminishing returns for everything. And I think when you look at what happened with the landslide Republican victory just a couple weeks ago, it's pretty obvious that people are just fed up with all these politically correct buzzwords. So what I'm trying to do is give people a game plan so we can liberate the middle class a little bit and give them some ideas and solutions to not only simplify their life but to get healthier. Now you mentioned you can't talk about off-grid living or simplifying life if you don't talk about the reasons why, and you have to discuss economy and finance. And you look at all the corruption, you look at all the manipulation that's happened in America. How long are we going to be the land of the free and the home of the brave, folks, if we don't have the guts to stand for principle? And what I mean by standing for principles, demanding that we all have the same rules, laws, and accountability for everybody. We're drunk on the Kool-Aid of political correctness, folks. We can't continue to have a special set of rules, laws, and accountabilities based on what group you're in. Now, you just look at, for example, the world reserve currency, which is the U.S. dollar, Gary.
Right.
You know, you have to mention that because the central banks around the world don't trust each other. They're buying gold and silver like crazy. The BRICS nations, Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, including now about 120 more nations, are using different baskets of currencies and silver and gold for trade, not just for the petrodollar, but for trade in general. So one of these days we're going to wake up and we're going to lose that exalted status of the world reserve currency. Now, when that happens, keep in mind, too, folks, the Federal Reserve has been printing up to $85 billion a month. The U.S. Treasury is giving out IOUs like a bunch of drunken sailors in a bar.
Right.
50% of the U.S. dollars, this hardly ever gets discussed, Gary, is abroad, is in different countries, because we have the world's reserve status. So when more countries stop using the U.S. dollar for oil, the petrodollar, or trade, that money is going to start moving back to the U.S. And what's going to happen? We could have major inflation. Now, we have, I think, purposeful major deflation right now to basically balance the inflation we're going to have later. But we have so much corruption. One great example is what happened recently in Germany with Verizon. They ended the contract because the NSA was doing so much surveillance on them. The law of diminishing return happens with everything, including technology, folks. And we've lost that balance in life between hard work, passions, and interests, between old and new, between nature and technology, between spending and saving, city and country. And we need to get that back, Gary.
You know, it's something also that I was thinking about as you were talking there, Rich, and we're talking with Rich Sheeban, by the way, talking about off-grid living, which is exactly what he's doing in Montana right now. And, of course, he's the author of a book out there called One New York Man's Journey to Off-Grid Living in Montana. And we'll tell you how you can get that book a little bit later. But the authenticity, you know, when you're living off-grid, or when most of us are working out here on Main Street, we look at life and we say, okay, here are the tangible things that we are doing. Here are the products of what we are doing, or the services that we provide. Here, you know, we see things, and they're authentic. They say, you're getting this for doing that. We don't see that in Washington. We don't see that in Washington thought. But more importantly, when you look at, for example, the Fed and the amount of money that they're pumping in right now in terms of stimulus money to the economy, we also don't see an authentic economy. You know, it seems to me that we ought to see a little bit of the survival of the fittest. And while it might be painful in the beginning, we get an idea of at least what the authentic economy is. You live in a situation where if you don't do the right things, the wrong things happen. I mean, you have an accountability there, but you talk about authenticity. You're about as pure in terms of authenticity as you can humanly get.
Well, and I agree with that to some extent. You know, I don't want people to think that I never go to town or never go to a bank or never go to a restaurant. You know, I do some of that stuff, but I do control a little more of my own destiny, Gary, than most Americans. Let me just give you some examples. You know, you talk about with the Fed. You talk about how, you know, we all know how the federal government doesn't practice what they preach. You know, one major example I use, and I can come up with 50 of them, is that they're proponents of severe gun laws. Right. But yet they are hiring bodyguards using taxpayer dollars to protect themselves. I mean, the hypocrisies are unbelievable. They want Common Core for schools, but yet they send their kids to private school. They're preaching socialism, but yet they live lavishly. So let me just give you one. I
call it, by the way, a government of our betters.
Yeah. But if you don't practice what you preach, Gary, I mean, if I didn't live off grid, would you have me on the radio several times on your show?
I might have you on for some other reasons, but it wouldn't be for that. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. So the point is, if I write a book on off-grid living, for example, and you found out that I wasn't doing it, in other words, practicing what I preach, I would have no credibility. And
exactly.
we need to transfer that same methodology and philosophy and ideology to the people who need to be accountable. Because when you're in government, you should be serving the people. It's actually turned around. It's gotten to the point where the government's got so corrupt, so large, so manipulated that they've turned it around and making the people serve the government. And that's not the case, the way it should be. Now, let me give you just one example with the question you just gave me. Look at the four largest banks: Bank of America, Citigroup, J.P. Morgan, Wells Fargo. Total deposits of QE3 was over $1 trillion with these banks. Now, these banks invested mostly in the stock market to drive up asset bubbles. In other words, to deceive Americans that the economy was getting stronger.
Exactly.
So, but that's not the case. Now, J.P. Morgan during QE3 saw deposits increase 9 times larger percentage than their gross loans. So, in other words, instead of giving money to the middle class in a form of lending and helping out small business, they gave a 9 times larger percentage into the stock market. You know,
and you just made the point that I wanted to make, and it's this, that by doing that, yeah, the stock market looked better, and when every time the president comes out, he says, by the way, look at the stock market, okay? But I think a lot of Americans have said, the hell with the stock market. That doesn't talk about me. That's not where I am right now. Risk is not as big a part of my life as it was before the recession came. And so we look at two different kinds of America, the America of the stock market, the America of Main Street. And they're in two different places, two different compartments right now, and never the twain shall meet.
May I address Main Street for a second, Gary?
Go ahead.
Okay, first of all, 40% of Americans have $500 or less in savings. 43 spend more than they earn. That means almost half of Americans are living in the moment. They have no light at the end of the tunnel. Now, since the 2008 crash, 83% of U.S. stocks are owned by 1% of the people. From 2009, 95% of the profits realized are basically the top 1%. For the first time, folks, in U.S. history, U.S. banks own a greater share of residential housing net worth than all the individual Americans put together. So free markets and supply and demand has basically been tossed out the window with the baby in the bathwater regarding subdivision and residential type housing. And that's one of the reasons I'm a proponent of buying a little acreage, even if you don't live off the grid, so you can control your own destiny with growing a garden. You don't have to deal with GMOs. You don't have to deal with hormone steroids and antibiotics. You don't have to deal with pesticides. I mean, folks, 1 out of 2 of us are dying of cancer in America.
I'm going to jump in there real quick, Rich, because we're right at a hard break. And what I want to do is I want to come back and talk a little bit more about your garden and about what you're doing there in terms of living off the grid. I think people need to hear those types of things. Rich Sheeban is our special guest this morning. He decided to leave New York and head off the grid, period, and live in Montana. Pretty much a self-sufficient guy, and he's written a book, One New York Man's Journey to Off-Grid Living in Montana. You can go to his website, by the way, at offgridmontana.com and check that out. But we'll be right back with Rich after this on the Gary Sutton Show on News Radio 910 WSBA. Welcome back to the Gary Sutton Show on WSBA. We're with Rich Sheeban, a man who had left the rat race, lives off the grid in Montana, author of One New York Man's Journey to Off-Grid Living in Montana. You can check out his website at offgridmontana.com. Really interesting stuff. And Rich is back with us on the Gary Sutton Show. You know, Rich, America might be getting more and more dependent right now on the government, but you don't really think about dependency. You kind of move to a very independent kind of style, and part of that is growing your own food and so forth. And you kind of alluded to that a moment ago, but talk about the things that you do now that you count on yourself for.
Well, first of all, I have to start by telling your listeners, Gary, that vitamins, minerals come from the soil. Okay, and most of American soil has been chemically, commercially, and mechanically beat to smithereens. For example, enzymes are so important. They basically act as catalysts for biochemical reaction, which aids in digestion and nutrient support. So, and they also have pH ranges and sensitivities as well. So I tell everybody to eat raw vegetables so they can get their enzymes, because when you cook your food over 130 degrees Fahrenheit, you're killing all the enzymes, folks. And this is very important information that you need to know. Now, you got to also be able to identify immune stimulants versus immune suppressants. And I also do what's called raised bed gardening instead of single row gardening. So I put like some logs on the outside, make a little rectangle. I virtually make my own soil, Gary. Now I use chicken manure and goat manure, basically laced with straw, because that's what I have. But for you people who live in subdivisions, do you rake lawns? Do you cut lawns?
Yeah.
Of course. Save all that stuff, folks. Don't put it out in the street so the county can pick it up. Put it in the corner of your garden and water it during the summer. Turn it over with a pitchfork once in a blue moon, and basically you're going to have soil. You're going to have rich, nutrient soil full of vitamins, minerals, and enzymes.
Never thought about that.
Yeah.
Never thought about that. I eat a lot. I've been telling people I've been changing my lifestyle, and I eat a lot of raw vegetables now and regular vegetables and a lot of poultry and things like that. And lost about 51 pounds in 50 days. So,
hey, congratulations.
Yeah, thanks. It has really changed the whole lifestyle. So, my wife and I have become, my wife's lost 20. So we've really worked hard at changing that. But again, in your situation, you're paying attention not only to growing off the land, but also kind of doing it in a way that you think is also going to help you. And obviously with some medical problems, you're certainly looking for things to help that as well, right?
Oh, absolutely. But nutrition, hydration, exercise, sleep, excess exposure to chemicals, which all Americans are getting hammered by. I mean,
you mentioned GMOs a moment ago, Rich, and I just wanted to come back to that. I'm not sure I buy in totally yet to the whole GMO thing, but why don't you try to convince me? I mean, I'd like to know. I'm learning about it. I'd like to know a little bit more about it. I'm looking at labels a lot when I go to the store now. Where do you stand on the whole GMOs, a genetically modified food?
Okay, I would love to. Okay, first of all,
you got about 2.5 minutes to do it, though, so you're going to be a good...
Okay, I'm going to try to rattle off as much information as possible. First of all, GMO foods is proven it causes cancer, DNA changes, and organ failure. And they're putting bacteria in the DNA of plants. If you buy food that's in vitro, in other words, in a test tube, or anything done in a laboratory, I highly recommend you do not do that. Go as organic as you possibly can. That's why it's so important to grow your own vegetables. Now, there are vegetables and seeds sold with herbicides in crops. In other words, poison, including antibiotics. One example of herbicide is Roundup. Now, there's also issues with farms who are growing GMOs. If the wind blows a seed and it germinates, if it pollinates and then germinates on your land, you being the neighbor of this farm, now these big corporations are getting patents on these seeds and are literally suing you. You should not be able to. In fact, it's in our law that you're not allowed to, use Mother Nature in any way and create patents. So there's so much corruption as well as the health aspects of it in the first place. Then you look at things like MSG, aspartame, all the other artificial sweeteners, nicotine, high fructose corn syrup. These are all designed to be addictive. Propylene glycol is in so much of our food.
Right.
This is an antifreeze. So I have a personal acronym in the book. It's called SARP, Synthetic, Artificial, Refined, and Processed. I'm not saying we need to be perfect, folks. I'm just saying we need to think a little more and just be a little more decisive and disciplined on what we consume.
Yeah, pretty good explanation there. And again, I'm reading a lot about it. I'm learning a lot about it. I've talked to a lot of people about it. And certainly, we're looking now at, for example, I stopped all drinking of any Diet Coke. I was drinking Diet sodas. I shouldn't say Diet Coke, but Diet sodas. And the only thing I drink now is water, lemon water, and hot lemon water. That's the extent of what I drink. I mean, I don't even drink tea, just because I want to put pure stuff through my body, and it tastes good. Now, I'm not saying I won't ever not take a drink of something else again, but I'm saying for now, that satisfies me, and I don't need anything else. So, I'm kind of with you there, and I'm looking very carefully at the ingredients that I put in my body and trying to put nothing but pure stuff in there. So your point is really well taken. Rich, I want to get together with you on a more regular basis here. We can continue to talk about some of this stuff from your vantage point, living off the grid and also being aware of what's on the grid out there as well. So thank you so much for joining us this morning, and let's try to do this on maybe a regular basis. What do you think?
That sounds great, Gary. Thank you so much. Always an honor to be on your show.
Always an honor to have you. Thank you so much, Rich.
Thank you, Gary.
Rich Sheeban with us on the Gary Sutton Show. Check out his website. It's really kind of cool. offgridmontana.com and see what some of his thoughts are. He's a really sharp guy. And as we said, left New York City and went to Montana and started a whole brand new life about 28 years ago, and it seems to be working out pretty well for him.